So today we will see one of the most interesting features of 3ds Max, that is editable poly. Editable poly is a type of object that has the possibility to manage vertices, edges, borders, polygons, or elements, and they can be created by using a modifier called edit poly, or you can convert any geometric object into an editable poly. And we will see, for example, how to use edit poly as a modifier, and we will see why sometimes this will be better as options. But anyway, let's start by setting our project. And the first thing that I like to do when I work with edit poly is I click default shading and I turn on the option called edged faces. In this way, I can clearly see where edges of my objects are, and if, for example, I increase number of segments, I can also see them exactly where they are. And second thing, what I will do is I will apply a modifier called edit poly. So what happens here is that now my box has not more the possibility to be adjusted by using length, width, or height, while I have these 5 different symbols. And these are buttons that will enable vertex tools, edge tools, border, polygon, and element. Not only, in a similar way to editable spline, what happens is that when we click vertex and we scroll down the menu of our edit poly modifier, we will have certain available tools. While when we click edge and we go down here, we will see completely different available tools. So we will basically start exploring a group of useful tools divided by the editing mode. And because edit poly is one of the most used feature in 3ds Max, and also it has a lot of tools, so we won't basically see them all due to the fact that this is a 3ds Max crash course just to start working from scratch. We will explore most useful features only. So, for example, we will start by discovering what happens and which tools are very interesting in Vertex edit mode. Perfect. So look, when I click Vertex, first thing is I can start by moving, rotating, or scaling vertices in my geometry. And if I explore the menu of edit poly a little bit below, I will see some interesting tools. For example, I can use remove. Remove is pretty interesting because it removes that selected vertex, while it doesn't delete the polygon that was technically including the vertex itself. And another interesting tool can be break, and what it does is it basically opens our solid object, and what was one single vertex now has been split in 3 different vertices. And exactly like we have seen in editable spline, the opposite of break is weld. So if we want, we can select these vertices, we can click settings, next to weld so that we will increase the distance in between, and when the threshold that we set here is longer than the actual distance between our vertices, these vertices will be welded together. Or we can do another thing that is called target weld. So if we have vertices that are connected by edges, we can left click and drag, and we can basically fuse these vertices in order to simplify our geometry. You have only to know that I can't weld this vertex with this one, because vertices, in order to work with target weld, must be connected by an edge. So I can weld these with this one probably, these with these, these with that, and I can't, for example, weld directly this one with the one on the right. I have to make it in two steps, 1 and 2. And this is target weld. Then we have other two basically interesting features. There are extrude and chamfer. And in order to use these features, instead of clicking the button itself, I will click always settings next to these features so that you have a bit more control. For example, if I want to extrude a vertex, I have these two values. There are, I can raise this vertex outside, or I can push it inside my geometry. And with my second parameter, I will set the dimension of the base of my extrusion. So I will technically make a spike from my vertex. And this works even if I select more than one vertex at the same time, and I can control the height and the dimension of the base of this extrusion. Chamfer instead is a last interesting tool that basically is a tool that will chop my vertex, so I can increase this value here, and what chamfer does is, instead of having my pointy vertex, it chops it. And again, it works even if we select more than one vertex at the same time. So if we click chamfer, we can chop all these selected vertices by removing that pointy tip. And now we can move into discovering interesting tools that are in edge editing mode. So what I will do now is I will simply start with another box, and I will repeat same steps that I've done before. So I have a box, I apply Edit Poly modifier, and now we are going to explore some of the most interesting tools inside edge editing mode that are. Again, we have remove. So if we click this button, we will take that edge out of our geometry without deleting the polygon that is attached, because if we select an edge and we hit delete from the keyboard, by deleting the edge we will also delete the polygon that is attached to the edge. Then we have split, and this is like break into vertex. So these will basically, if I click split, maybe I select more and I click split, perfect. So now if I move this edge, I will see that basically I have opened my geometry. Okay, and exactly like before, we have target weld if we want to do the opposite of splitting edges. and we can rebuild our geometry. Then, even in edge, we have extrude and chamfer, but this time they will work by raising up or down the entire edge, but with a very similar behavior. So we can change the height, and then we can also change the base size. And same thing can be done not only by pulling out our edges, but if we select a negative height, we will basically push edges inside our geometry so that we can also create grooves in our starting solid object. Then we have chamfer, and chamfer into edge is a little bit more complex and more interesting than vertex, because if I click chamfer, I can see first of all that I have a lot more control, but basically with chamfer I can obtain two main results that are: if I by default change this parameter, with chamfer I will simply chop my starting edge. But what is interesting is if I also manage this additional parameter that by default is always 1, that is segment, I can place more segments in between my new created edges, and if I do this, what I obtain is a round corner instead of a flat one. So, into edge editing mode, chamfer has two main functions: not only to chop with a straight cut, but also it is the tool that you have to use if you want to basically create rounded corners. And then another tool that I want to show you into edge editing mode is the one that is called connect. So what it does is basically this: if you select two edges and then you click settings next to connect, you can basically create additional edges that are starting and ending from your two selected edges. And by default, they will start from the midpoint and they will end into the midpoint of your next edge. But you can first choose how many edges you want. Then you can pinch these edges so that they are not equally spaced. And then you can also slide them in order to offset their position. This tool is extremely interesting when we want to add additional edges only in certain areas of our editable poly. It also works if our edges are not parallel. It perfectly works. So it always creates connections between our selected edges. It also works if we select more than two edges. So for example, if we select these 4 edges and we click connect, you will see that our edges will be created like in a loop. And you can change their size, their amount, and then you can click OK, and you have created these complex subdivisions in a fraction of the time. And last but not least, another interesting tool that you find into Edge Edit mode is the one that is called Create Shape. And what it does is basically, by selecting one or more and how many edges you want, the tool called Create Shape, by clicking this button here, creates a new object that is a copy of your selected edges, and that was the name. And what is interesting is that this copy is actually an editable spline. So if I close edge editing mode and I just move my editable poly, what I will see is this. So from my edges I have this new object that is a copy of those edges, that is an editable spline. And with this editable spline I can use all editable spline tools. Most frequently this tool is used by simply giving our editable spline a visible thickness. And I can have this three-dimensional wire structure that has been created as copy of edges of my editable poly. So now let's quickly see border tools, and I will, just to repeat, create a box, apply edit poly, and I will see when I click border that I have no borders to select. This is why, simply because borders in 3ds Max are loops of edges that are available only when there is a missing polygon. So what it means? It simply means this. If my object has a hole, so if I select a polygon and I delete it, and I can see this missing geometry, so I can basically see inside my object, now I have a border that is this loop over here. So no matter how many edges are all around my hole, if I click one of them, my 3ds Max will select them all because they are considered one border. So, which are interesting tools that we find here? Well, there are mainly 2 or 3. Like, we have one of the most useful tool that is cap, that basically closes our hole. So that is excellent when we have unwanted holes in our geometry and we want to quickly close our object in order to turn our object into a solid. But we can, and let me create another hole. So another thing that we can do instead is we can extrude a border. So by extruding a border we can basically raise these vertex edges, and we can also change the chamfer beginning. We can then use cap only at the end. And the most interesting part is when we have objects with more holes and we want to connect them. So I want to show you now how to use bridge. And in order to use bridge, I need to create a slightly different shape. So I need 3 seconds to create a slightly different object. Look, I will make one spline, something like this. Perfect. Then I will apply extrude to turn this spline into a 3-dimensional object. And then I will apply edit poly. I have simply to select these 2 polygons and I can click delete. So what I can do next is I can select this border. I can, by holding Control, I can select this other border and I can use the tool that is called bridge. And by using this tool I can basically create a geometry that will go from first to second border. And into bridge parameters I can increase number of segments, I can increase or decrease the taper that basically will simulate the tension or pressure. I can change the bias to move the center of my taper closer to one or the other. I can choose to smooth or not my bridge, and I can also twist the bridge. Full disclaimer, this same exact function is something that we will see in a second into Polygon editing mode as well. So now we can see Polygon tools. There are really a lot, and see this. First of all, I will show you why it is interesting to use Edit Poly as a modifier, because if I want to go back to my starting setup, I can simply select my modifier and I can hit this tiny button to remove it from my geometry. And then I can apply another one, so that I will start basically from my initial 3D object. I will click Polygon, and I will see that when I click Polygon, I have a lot of tools. Some of them are pretty simple, some of them are a little bit more complex. So, let's start with Extrude. And Extrude is very simple because it basically raises our polygon according to its normal direction, and if you use a positive value it will go outside your geometry, while if you use a negative value it will go inside your geometry. But when we use Extrude into Polygon edit mode, we have more options. So we have this option here that is basically Extrude by. And we can choose group, normals, local or by polygon. So this becomes pretty handy when we select polygons that are connected to each other. So when we select these polygons, 3ds Max will use a direction that is the average in between all these three selected normal directions, while we can use instead local normals, and we will extrude each polygon along its normal direction. But because original polygons are connected, even extruded polygons will be connected. Or third option will be by polygon, and each polygon will be extruded as a completely independent polygon, even if they started as connected elements. Then we have another interesting tool that is called Inset. And what Inset does is it basically creates an offset of our selected polygon or polygons. So again, if we select just one polygon and we use Inset, this is what happens. So we create an offset of our selection. And the thing becomes more interesting again when we select more polygons at the same time, because if we click Inset now, again, by default, 3ds Max uses Inset by group, so it will basically try to make an offset of our entire selection. Or if we open this option and we choose by polygon, each polygon will be offset with the same value, but it will be treated as completely independent polygon. And let me tell you, in general, Inset and Extrude are like bread and butter, so they always works together in a very interesting way. So I can use Inset and then Extrude to start adding a lot of details to my finished object. Something that is instead very similar to Extrude is Bevel. The only difference between Extrude and Bevel is that when we use Bevel, our extrusion can be also scaled. So we have two controls, and if we want, then look, this is just extrude. So if we want, we can scale while we are extruding our polygon or polygons. Then we have bridge, and for example, to make a bridge, I will first extrude these two polygons. Okay, and then I will select these two facing polygons, and exactly like we've seen into borders, even if we have not borders, we can even use bridge into polygons to create connections between facing polygons, and we have same exact features. We can choose the amount of segments, we can change the taper, we can change the bias, we can smooth it or not, we can twist it also, and this works even if we have polygons and not only if we have borders. Then there are last two interesting tools that are a little bit more complex that I want to show you, that are a little bit below these main tools, and you find them called hinge from edge and extrude along a spline. Hinge from edge is very interesting because what it does is you have to select a polygon, you click settings next to hinge from edge, and then first thing you have to do is you have to click this tiny button here that is pick edge. Let's say I will pick this one, and now if I change the angle, what happens is that my selected polygon will be rotated by using that edge as rotation axis. And then if I want, I can not only choose the angle, and I can even type it if I want something more precise, but if I increase this parameter that is edges, instead of having these flat connection, I can have a rounded result. And this works even if the polygon and the edge that you are using are not immediately connected. So if I select this one and I click hinge from edge, I can even pick this edge here, but I will select this polygon, pick the edge, pick this one, and you can see that this will be used as rotation axis. And then I can again change the number of vertices, or I can pick another polygon, maybe this one, while I'm still using this edge as rotation axis, and I can choose the angle, number of edges, and this is what hinge from edge does. Last but not least is extrude along a spline, but as the name says, I need one editable spline to be created before. So before using this tool, I will quickly draw a line, and notice that I have started here, so this is my vertex number 1. So what extrude along a spline does is very simple. You select polygon, maybe I select this polygon, but not because this is horizontal, I'm just making an example. So I will click extrude along a spline, and I always click settings here. Then first button that I click is pick a spline. I will pick these, and this is what happens. my polygon has been extruded and the shape that I obtain follows the drawing that I've made, but as you can see, this right now looks like it is flipped, so I can make a lot of adjustments, like I can rotate how my spline is oriented according to the position of my selected polygon. I can change the amount of segments, and this would be pretty handy if my spline is a curvy spline rather than this sharp looking shape. Then I can choose to taper, so I can basically increase or decrease size of my final vertex in my edit poly. I can basically use a taper curve if I want to inflate or deflate the taper. I can twist my extrusion along the path as well. So let's taper less or even 0, that is better. And then I can also choose align to the face normal. Why this is important? Look, my face has the normal that is basically with the same alignment of my editable spline. But if I pick this face here that is pointing up, if I use extrude along a spline and I pick the spline and I pick this one, by default this option must be enabled, so that not because the spline is horizontal the extrusion goes horizontally, while it follows the normal direction of our selected polygon. So this is extremely important, because if this is not set, this is what happens. So even if the face that I've selected is vertically oriented, the extrusion will follow the real orientation of our spline. Let me tell you, this is a very quick and simple feature that you can use in order to quickly create trees or stuff like that. If I create 3 different splines, one bigger and then 2 that are slightly smaller, for example, I can create a cylinder, and maybe I can use less polygons, something like that. Then I can apply edit poly, and I can start by selecting this element, and I can start by making a very rough looking tree. I mean, this would be very fast by using extrude along a spline, and I will pick my bigger spline, and maybe I will use taper here, 2, and this is 0, so to make the top of the tree becoming a little bit smaller. But then I can pick the top, and I can, by holding Control, I can pick this polygon, control this polygon, control that polygon, click again, extrude along a spline, pick my second spline, this one. So pick the spline and pick the spline, select these polygons exactly, and I will start by making my rough looking branches, and then I will continue by clicking again, extrude along a spline, pick this smaller spline, and I will randomly select more polygons at the same time, so that I will have smaller branches created from main body of this tree. I will click OK, and in a few steps I have started blocking a 3D model of a tree. And later on this course we will see how to make a more realistic looking tree by smoothing edges and so on and so on. So last thing that we are going to see will be tools into element mode. In element mode, believe it or not, the only useful tool that I find interesting is the one that is called Insert Vertex. So, if you click Edit Poly, then you click Element, this is, in one click, the way to select the entire object. And let me tell you, the only thing that I always found interesting is clicking Insert Vertex allows you to click whatever you want inside your element, and this allows you to create additional vertices, nothing more than this. While in general this feature is selecting elements is more interesting to attach or detach parts of our object, or when we will study materials, to quickly apply different materials to set certain parts of our object. I want to show you now last group of tools that you may find interesting in Editable Poly that are not even related to any specific editing mode, and these are Slice, Cut, Attach, Detach. So first of all, no matter, even if I have no selection here, if I right click on my object, I can find this button called Cut. And when I click on my object, I can cut existing faces in order to add additional edges along my editable poly. And when I do this, my mouse shape changes, because when I am like this in the middle of nowhere, I have this small square with these small lines. But if I am perfectly on an existing edge, my cursor changes and it becomes with this thinner vertical line and slightly thicker horizontal line. But if I click perfectly on an existing vertex, instead my cursor will become a very tiny cross. So this feature can be also used without snap feature enabled. Or if you want to be more precise and if you want to hit exactly the midpoint here, then yes, you can, using, let's say, midpoint snap, and you can also snap perfectly midpoints as well as vertices or any other snapping feature. There is something very similar to Cut that is called Slice into Editable Poly. The only difference between Cut and Slice is that when I click Cut, I am keeping the integrity of my geometry, while if I go to my Editable Poly and, for example, I find that Slice is not available, I have to select one of my editing mode, and it doesn't matter which one. In general, I always like to select Polygon, but then feel free to select the one that you want. And when I click Slice Plane, I have this plane that I can modify, and I can move it, I can also rotate it. And what happens now is pretty interesting, because if I just click this slice button, what I create is as intersection between my plane and the solid that I am editing, I will create a loop of, and I have to select in this case polygons that I want to slice. So I select them all, click slice plane, and I will get this. So you can see the preview of my slice. Then I click slice, and I have simply created this loop of new edges. But slice has also this additional option called split. And if I use this option, when I click slice, and I can click it from this pop-up menu as well as from this button here, it is exactly the same. But with the split option enabled, what I do is I divide my object into two elements. So check this, I click splice. Now I can turn this thing off, and I will select elements, and by using split I have this element here and this element as detached part. So technically we have now two elements, and we have also two borders. So what you can do is you can select borders now. I can select this one, and with control I can select this one, and you are free to use border tools. So you can click cap if you just want to make two solid objects, or I can control Z. For example, I can use bridge, and maybe, I don't know, I can change number of segments, I can change a little bit the taper in between these two borders, and I can create a very complex looking object by following these simple methods and by using only tools that I find inside Editable Poly. Editable Poly is a lot more complex than this simple explanation. When we use Edit Poly, or we right click and we convert to Editable Poly, believe it or not, we have a lot more tools that we find in this bar that is called the graphite tool. But we will see this into another video, because if not, the explanation will become a lot more complex. So, if you find this video interesting, hit the like button, feel free to comment, make me questions, and if you want, feel free to subscribe and to share this video. Okay? And as usual, have fun. Bye!